Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 7 of our Flatten the Curve video blog. I am Daniel Fung from MoveUp's Communications Department, and for lucky episode number 7, I have the good fortune to be joined by Bowinn Ma. Among her roles, she is the BC NDP MLA for North Vancouver-Lonsdale, the Parliamentary Secretary for TransLink, and especially recently, one of the more outspoken voices against anti-Asian racism. So welcome, Bowinn, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for having me.
Now, Bowen, when we first put out a request for to have you join us a couple of weeks ago, that came at a time when we were seeing all of these acts of violence and vandalism happening locally that were targeting people of Asian backgrounds. And then in the weeks since then, sparked by the murder of George Floyd in the US, the issue of racism and systemic discrimination of the Black community has been front and center, and rightfully so. So I really want to talk to you about that and about other forms of racism and oppression that we deal with. But I want to address them each separately because I think that's important and I don't want one issue to overshadow another. So let's start with the anti-Asian sentiment and violence that we've seen, particularly since the start of the pandemic. I want to ask you, not as a politician, but as an individual and as an Asian, what were your first thoughts when you started seeing those things happening?
Well, Daniel, I would say that I was shocked and yet unsurprised. I mean, emotionally, I recoiled, but intellectually, I knew that this shouldn't surprise me. There is a current of anti Asian racism that has existed here for a long time, and to deny its existence is, I think, naive. And yet, I was so sad. The thought of my sister or my mother or my grandmother, I like the thought of my neighbors or community members who might have found themselves in a situation like that. And I thought also of people like Dakota, who was Indigenous, who was caught in the crossfire, and I worried for the safety of my family, my friends, my neighbors, my community, and people that I didn't even know, because it's the being subjected to hate crimes can be extremely jarring, and seeing other people subjected to them is also very jarring. There's nothing that you can do to prevent from being targeted. It's like you're not being targeted because you've done something or said something, or even maybe you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like it's so unpredictable, and I can understand why it would be so devastating for people to see that happen. And I also wondered what this meant for people of color going forward. Um, I was born in Canada. I was raised in Canada, lived in Canada. I even joined the Canadian Armed Forces for a while, and I grew up so proud to be Canadian. And it's a desperately exhausting and deeply sad feeling that comes with wondering at what point I or others like me will be seen as Canadian enough to not be othered.
And I can definitely relate to as someone who grew up here. And I think all of us growing up here, myself included, we want to believe that deep down, Canada is not a racist country. But I think sometimes part of that thinking is what has led us to be blind to the fact that these attitudes and these sentiments are very real. And that when there are these ways of thinking that are built into people's minds over time, and when you leave them unchallenged, they stick. And then the reaction, as we've seen, can be dangerous. So especially for the Chinese here, since COVID-19, it's that stereotype of being diseased or dirty. But for the Black community, and especially in the U.S., it's been decades of being associated with being criminals or thugs, and that has contributed to the widespread violence against that community. We've seen people rise up against this in the past, but still, we've never been able to break away from that concept. Now we're seeing people starting to rise up again now. And in your mind, is this time any different?
Well, I think that time will tell. But this is certainly the largest, most sustained uprising that I have ever lived through personally. And certainly I feel as though this movement has reached a critical mass where the anger and the frustration and sustained long-term oppression faced by Black people, both in the US and up here in Canada, is being presented in front of all of us in a way that we can't ignore. And people who are calling for defending of police, I find that there are actually people who are listening as well. People are actually talking and having real conversations about what that means. And I think that those kinds of conversations are how change happens.
And I'd be also remiss if I didn't bring up the experiences of our Indigenous peoples here, because for Indigenous peoples, the historic treatment has been similar in some ways to what the Black community has experienced, at least in terms of that targeted violence, the suppression and labeling. I think a lot of us were very, very proud under this government's leadership when we became the first Canadian province to pass the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples Bill, so that's UNDRIP. It's positive, but it's a start, and it's only a start. So how do we as a society have to continue to work to truly eliminate systemic discrimination?
Yeah, I think, Daniel, you're right that it is a start, but it's important work and foundational work that is absolutely necessary. And while there's more work to do, a huge amount of work has definitely been done by our government since 2017. So you mentioned DRIPA, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which basically provides a framework to help us decolonize our laws. And the act establishes the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as the foundational framework for reconciliation in BC. But it wasn't a magic wand. It didn't suddenly fix everything. It opened the door and laid out a structure for First Nations and Indigenous people to be a part of policy making and to be a part of correcting some of the colonial laws that still exist within our law's legal structure. But in addition to that, we've also brought back the Human Rights Commission. And this is really quite also very foundational work. BC, for over 10 years, was the only province in Canada without a Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Commission is different from the Human Rights Tribunal in that tribunals deal with cases of discrimination on a case-by-case basis. But the Human Rights Commission deals with human rights issues from a systemic level and from a societal level. And that is work that hasn't been happening over the last 10 years before we brought it back. But there's even more specific things that we can be proud of that we've done here. For instance, we've changed laws to strengthen BC's Independent Investigations Office, which independently investigates police-involved incidents that result in death or serious harm. And we introduced new binding standards on police stops that forbid arbitrary stops or ones based on race. There's also a lot of other aspects of systemic racism that we can deal with, and we have dealt with, and we need to continue to deal with. So, for instance, we know that Indigenous people make up more than 50% of the youth in private like foster care homes in Canada, even though they only make up about 8% of the child population. So we know there's something going on there. And we know that when we help support former youth in care, we're actually also helping to break through some of the systemic barriers that keep those Indigenous children from succeeding. So for instance, tuition-free post-secondary education for former youth in care is enormously important. And since we expanded that program to every post-secondary institution in the province, over 443% more former youth in care have enrolled in post-secondary education and found which gives them an opportunity to find a way forward. We've also ended the use of birth alerts, which was a very controversial practice that meant that vulnerable mothers, disproportionately Indigenous mothers, were having their babies ripped away from them within hours after they were born. That was happening here in BC, and it wasn't until very recently that we put an end to it. We also created agreements with First Nations and Métis communities to return child welfare jurisdiction to those communities. A huge fundamental change in the way that we help try to help children who maybe are finding themselves in a place where they can't stay at home. Instead of ripping them out of their communities entirely, how do we find ways to keep them within their Indigenous communities, keep the connections going, allow them to learn more about their culture, and feel as though they continue to have a place in the world. And also, David Eby, right before COVID-19, actually released an agreement that he had made called the First Nations Justice Strategy, which is a historic initiative to develop a justice strategy for Indigenous peoples in British Columbia that is authored by Indigenous people themselves. So we're looking to bring in First Nations laws and justice systems and bring them in here to British Columbia. So those are the kinds of things that we can do that are not performative acts of solidarity, but actual fundamental changes that hit systemic racism and institutional bias at its core and help us work towards reconciliation. But there's way more to do, and we have to maintain the course.
Mm-hmm. And I'm really glad to hear you say all that, and that you're right. It's not just saying the right words at the right time. It is really addressing those systems and also listening to all these groups while you're addressing those systems. And I think that's important. And there's a lot obviously that this government has done in that time, and people can find all those initiatives that you just mentioned just now. Premier Horgan also spoke recently about pushing for a national anti-racism program. In your opinion, what would that look like? And I assume it might be very similar to what some of the work that we've already done here in BC.
Yeah, I definitely think that a national anti-racism program, especially one that is focused on Indigenous reconciliation, will have to include a lot of the work that we've done here in BC. But if he's referring to an anti-racism program beyond even specifically for Indigenous people, but across the board, I think that whatever it looks like, it needs to start with education, because it's obviously not up to the level that we need it to be at if we really want to tackle racism. I mean, we have premiers in this country, not our premier, thank goodness, but we have premiers in this country who are actively denying that systemic racism even exists. And how can we tackle a problem that we can't even acknowledge? So I think education is will have to be a big part of it.
And I had a chance to read Premier Horgan's op-ed where he addresses, BC does have a history of racism, and you're right, we can't move forward if we don't acknowledge those things. And he named many different examples in the op-ed, and truthfully there will be things that are missed because we sometimes they're not top of mind, but they're there, and it is important to address all of those things and know where we have been in the past in order for us to shape that better future. I want to switch gears a little bit slightly, and before we run out of time, because I don't want to miss a chance to ask you about public transit, because I think many people know you're a huge supporter of public transit. A lot of the members of our union were especially relieved back in May when the planned service cuts and the layoffs at Translink didn't go through, and that's thanks in no small part to the provincial government. But given the effects of COVID-19, we know that in order for public transit to be able to continue to be sustainable in the long term, we're going to need federal government to step up with some funding to sustain that. Are you surprised that the Prime Minister hasn't looked at the public transit systems across the country and has said that we recognize how important this is and we need to step up to invest in it? That hasn't happened, at least not to my knowledge.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this speaks to the importance of the kind of work that Premier John Horgan has been doing, because he's been very vocal and very deliberate about raising the importance of public transit every time he speaks in those meetings that he has with other premiers and the Prime Minister. And like every other public transit system in the country, Translink definitely took a financial hit as a result of COVID-19. And honestly, probably more so than other systems, because Translink normally has a particularly high fare box recovery rate. That means that the system is funded more by fares than other systems, and normally that's seen as a very good thing, but it's created challenges, and these are the kinds of challenges that the BC government has committed to working with Translink on, because as you said, I mean, a strong public transit system is absolutely critical, both for our restart and well into the future. So Premier John Horgan has been advocating for support for transit within the federal government, and I have no doubt that last week's federal announcement of $14 billion worth of funding for provinces to do what they call support a safe restart was in large part due to his consistent efforts on this. Now, in the days ahead, we're going to be working with the federal government to understand more about what this money means for BC and what we can do with it to make sure people have the services they need, like transit.
And I know a lot of people will be watching that very, very keenly because it's not only our members who work in public transit, but so many people rely on it every day to get to where they need to get to, whether it's work or school, to get groceries. So it's something that we will be watching very closely for sure. Bowinn, again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us on topics I know that aren't easy to talk about. I've always respected you for not being able to use your voice, not being afraid to admit when you've made a mistake, because we all do and we're all human, but also for being a reflection for people of color and millennials, as well as women in politics. I think we absolutely need more people like you that people like me can relate to. I'm not a woman, but I am a millennial. I am an Asian. And I think that's the truth. Regardless of where you land on the political spectrum, we want to see people who reflect who we are in politics. And so before we conclude, is there anything in particular that you want to say to our members that move up?
Oh, well, first off, thank you so much, Daniel, for having me here. And I definitely want to thank your members for the work that they do. So many of your members work through COVID-19 as essential workers in jobs that are frankly some of the most underappreciated work in our society. And this pandemic has really revealed who keeps our society going in times of crisis. And your members have been a huge part of that lifeblood of our society. So yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you to each and every one of you for all that you do to support our communities and each other, because strong unions help create strong societies that can overcome inequality and lift everybody up. So thank you.
Thank you, Bowinn. It was a pleasure to have you join us. You are welcome back anytime.
I look forward to it.